The following episode contains content that is solely the opinions and experiences of the participants themselves. If you require help, please contact a local mental health professional or support organizations.
A man walks into a library and brings with him a guitar and an amplifier. Then, on top of a table, starts playing a Black Sabbath song. The librarian shuts it down and asks him, "What do you think you're doing? You can't do that in here." And he responds, "What are you talking about? This place is full of hardcovers." First things first, I want to ask you if you have heard the new Deftones.
I have not, but a very good friend of mine in London has recommended it highly to me.
It's fantastic.
Nice.
I don't think they've ever put out a bad record.
I would have to agree with that.
This new one reminds me a little bit of White Pony.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's some self-titled, the one after White Pony in that.
Mm-hmm.
The guitarist's rhythm tone is super deep.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like, if you listen to Genesis, the first song on the album, it's super heavy, especially at the end of the song. Ohms, the first single they released, is the last track on the album, and that's pretty heavy. Ceremony, which is the second track, is pretty heavy. As a bass player myself, really cool bass line in Ceremony, and they use the bass line for the chorus.
Oh, I'm definitely going to have to check it out.
What about Guardians by August Burns Red?
Checked out some of it. It's great, as most August Burns Red albums are.
Mm-hmm.
Nice and heavy, and yeah, I love it.
I thought they took a bold risk with one of the songs in the middle of the album where it's mostly singing and not a whole lot of screaming.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, it's something that's totally and completely unexpected from a band like that, right?
Mm-hmm. I met you years and years ago, like 2009, 2010.
Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day. Yeah, it would be around 2009, 2010 for sure.
Mm-hmm. We were in a band together called Avitas, which has a storied past. We don't really have to. We don't have to get into the nitty gritty of who was involved with that and what went on. But it was a very interesting experience for myself because I watched something implode right before my eyes.
Yeah, and for my experience in that band, well, you know the history of my time in that band, but I kind of felt the same thing. And in my time there, like, I loved the musicianship, I loved the sounds we were making, but it was kind of the back channel stuff that happens, that kind of happens in every band, just kind of got to me in the end, and I had some health issues kind of pop up on me all of a sudden and needed to take that step away when I stepped away from that band.
Mm-hmm. It really sucks how, like, inner politics and stuff in a band can sour things. Sometimes I wonder, like, why I stayed in it for so long. We changed directions and we added new people to it and we made the sound different, so I'm like, oh, okay, this will be new and maybe things will straighten out. But no, they did not.
Yeah, and I hold no ill will towards anybody that was a part of that project when I was in it. Can't say that we're friendly or anything like that today, but I'm a strong believer in that every project you're a part of, whether it's solo, part of a band, part of a duo, part of whatever, is going to help you grow as an artist and a musician. Totally. And that band was so completely different than anything I had ever done. I was a punk musician for, 20 years before I jumped into Avitas. And to go in and have to learn and write and prepare myself for more of a symphonic metal type sound was something that was so completely out of the norm for me. It was an amazing time to be able to learn and kind of spread my wings a little bit as a rhythm guitar player, to be able to get that style under my belt and be able to confidently say, this is the direction I think the song should go.
As a bass player, I noticed that I was going up and down the neck a lot more. double tones from two strings at the same time with my thumb and index finger. And I totally agree with what you're saying. Even if a project doesn't work out, you at least take something with you from it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've been in numerous bands. Like I picked up the guitar. I can still remember my very first guitar was purchased out of a Sears catalog in 1989 for Christmas. I'll remember it to the day I die. It was a little cheap Fender Strat copy, and I played on a little 15-watt Fender practice amp. I learned by playing along to things on the radio and things like that. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until I got out of high school and I started getting into bands and getting into different projects that I really started to grow as a guitar player. Like I said, every project brought something different into it. I was in a band called Spitting Star for a while that was female fronted and heavily influenced by Scratching Post, who was a huge band out of London at the time. That brought me into like drop tuning and being able to play songs that weren't in your standard E tuning. Mm-hmm. And like I said, Avitas with you was getting away from my punk roots and going more into that symphonic metal that I still listen to from time to time. It's so different than what you're normally hearing over the airwaves on radio or what have you. Being a guitar player, you want to have all that experience, right? You want to be able to pull in from different influences and different projects and be able to kind of mesh them into your own style, for sure.
It's kind of funny when everything sort of imploded, like the final nail in the coffin. Everything was pretty much left to me. Well, me and two other people. I have all the CDs. Every single CD of the first Avitas EP, which is the only thing we ever released. I have like boxes full of them.
Still holding on to them, eh?
Yep.
I still have my copy. It's on my CD shelf. I can't bring myself to get rid of it. Every once in a while, it actually shows up on my phone where a particular song will come on, and I'm like, I remember writing part of the guitar line to that and feeling like a bit of a sense of pride even though I wasn't there for the recording and I didn't really do a whole lot of live shows in my time. To know that I left at least some sort of a mark was, to me, satisfaction enough.
Yeah, because it's like, even though things didn't turn out well, that's still your contribution to it. Like, you created a part of that music, so it's not anything to listen to it because you can enjoy it still, because it's like, I did that.
Absolutely. Yeah, even if, like I said, even if I wasn't part of the band when the EP was recorded, the legacy lives on, I guess.
So you're in a band now called Out of Time?
Yes.
And that's mostly focused on covers.
It's 100% covers. We are a 90s and early 2000s cover band. And the nice thing about that is it lets a guy like me who just turned 45 a few days ago be able to go out and play the songs that I learned when I was learning how to play guitar. And I get to go up on stage, once or twice a month at a bar and kind of relive my glory days as a young guitarist. It's one of the most fun projects I've ever been a part of. I'm enjoying myself immensely in this project.
The audiobook that I have a part in it where it talks about cover bands and how the audiences are a lot different at cover shows. What do you notice from the shows that like we would play together, like original stuff with Avitas and some of the other bands that you've been in, compared to what the crowds are like now? Well, not now because of COVID, but yeah. Before COVID happened, I would assume the crowds are a lot more different.
Yeah, like as part of Avitas or any other original band that I was in playing a show, the first thing is I tend to be playing to more people as a cover artist. Like, it was really tough there as an original guy who didn't have let me back up. So when I was an original artist, streaming wasn't a thing. Facebook wasn't a thing. MySpace was in its infancy. It was very difficult to spread yourself as an independent original artist by anything other than word of mouth. And the only way that you got word of mouth was to tour your ass off. I didn't have the ability to tour my ass off, so it was basically play every dingy bar that you could for 5 or 10 people. As a cover artist, it's completely different. We're not the draw as a cover artist. We just happen to be human jukebox, I find. So the bar has its own crowd. We certainly do bring a few people in on our own, but the crowd itself, they're right into it. They're drinking, they're doing whatever, but there seems to be a lot more interaction with the crowd because they recognize the songs that we're playing. Because we're doing that 90s and early 2000s kick, it's quite often songs that they haven't heard in 10, 15, 20 years unless they're listening to satellite radio and have like the Lithium channel on. So to be able to look out from the stage and see the recognition when we play one of the one-hit wonder songs that are part of our set list is just amazing. The crowd reactions that we've been getting have been absolutely fantastic. At least once a show, we have a bunch of people come up and say, like, I can't believe you're playing that song. Like, I haven't heard that song in 30 years. And that's where I get my kicks, is to get that reaction.
I could guess that the crowd at a cover show is a lot more energetic, enthusiastic, because it's stuff that they do know, and you just said it, they haven't heard it in quite a while. So it sort of brings that whole world back to them and the memories. And
absolutely. I like to think of ourselves as a 5-man time machine, really. Mm-hmm. Like I said, like I'm 45, so I'm quite a bit older than the other guys in the band. So my heyday for 90s music were more the early 90s, when Seattle was really starting to pick up with Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Mudhoney and Nirvana and the bands of that ilk. And then the rest of the band tend to kind of tail to the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. So you're getting into like your Jimmy Eat Worlds, the Foo Fighters were starting to come out then and things like that. So if we could just find a guy that kind of fit in the middle and gave us the middle 90s, it'd be great. Our set list tends to be either very early 90s or later on in the decade. But yeah, to see the dance floor going nuts for a cover song is a great feeling. It's makes it certainly worthwhile because as I'm sure you're aware, you're not in it for the money at that point. So
no,
I've always said, like, if I make enough from a cover gig to cover my beer tab and my wife's tab at the night if she happens to come with, then that's all I really need. I just love to play, and this is the outlet that I have now aside from my side project.
I have a couple of cover songs that I'm just going to run by you to see if your band does play it.
For sure.
Do you play My Own Worst Enemy by Lit?
We do. I'm not the lead player in this band, and you've known me for a while, and you've known me to be more of a stronger rhythm player
right.
than the lead guy. But that is a song that I actually do play the lead on, and it's a fantastically fun octave slide solo to play. It's great.
Do you play The Way by Fastball?
We don't yet, but we're talking about it, and the hang-up on that song is there's a very prominent keyboard part in that song. So it's difficult to try and figure out how to mimic that keyboard part with 2 guitar players, but it's certainly on our list.
Do you play any Cranberries?
We wanted to do Zombie, and then Bad Wolves came out and ruined it for us because now it's a cover of a cover, and they did such a fantastic job that anything we did, that it would just be a hack. So as soon as that Bad Wolves tune came out, that was the end of that.
Did you know that Dolores, before she passed away, she was originally going to be on that cover?
Yes, and as the story goes, the band ended up following through on their word and donated every single cent of the profit of that song to her family.
That was very kind of them. I did hear about that. And not a whole lot of people might know that Dolores and her family live in the Toronto area.
Yeah, she was married to a Canadian.
Mm-hmm. One of the best female singers of the 90s, just right down the highway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely iconic voice. I love the Cranberries. I always have. And I always said that if I was ever going to do something female-fronted again, that I wasn't going to go the heavy route, that I was going to go with something along that line, in that vein. And I think that's my 90s influence coming out in me again, because that is such a very 90s-ish band the Cranberries were.
COVID completely threw a wrench into the world of music and performance. I just wanted to sort of see how your band dealt with that, and what methods did you use to keep normalcy with, practices and jamming and having fun.
Sure. So we were lucky that we struck a relationship up with 3 or 4 local bars down here, and we were booked solid for the year from February all the way through to December. So we lost countless shows. When the bulk of the isolation was happening, our bass player, who coincidentally is also named Scott, so I think I just have a thing for bass players named Scott.
Nice.
His fiance is a nurse down here, and she worked in a field hospital for long-term care home residents who were COVID positive. So as long as she was working in that field hospital, we couldn't practice. Practicing without anybody is, to me, 1, not as fun, and 2, a bit of a difficult thing to do. Like, you can't build tightness as a band if you've got, one wheel out of the car missing, right? We also went through a lineup change shortly after our last show in March. So we didn't have a lead guitar player for a few months while COVID was kind of waiting, but we had somebody waiting in the wings. We literally hired him the day before Doug Ford shut down Ontario. So we sent the song list, and at that point we weren't necessarily adding new songs, but we'd been together for a year by that point. So we were not quite on autopilot, but we were to a point where unless we were adding new songs, we didn't need to necessarily get together every week like we had been. So we felt like we were in an okay spot. We've since switched out that guitar player, but we're now back to practicing. We've been practicing, I want to say we got back together, I want to say it was June maybe we started. Might have been the end of May, early June. We started getting back together. And the nice thing about bringing a new person into a band, especially as a cover band, is they bring their own certain set of influences in. We had a song list of, 50 or 55 songs, and you play 40 or 45 in a night in a bar if you're a cover band in 3 sets, and away you go. Well, he comes in, awesome to play with. I love playing along with him. But he's like, yeah, I know, like, Cherub Rock by Smashing Pumpkins. We can do that one. I know a couple Our Lady Peace tunes. And then we go, okay, but now we've got an opportunity, because we had songs in our list of 50 that just weren't working, that were maybe too slow for a bar environment, or that we just don't enjoy playing. So let's switch them out. So now we're adding songs like Fell on Black Days by Soundgarden. We're adding Man in the Box by Alice in Chains, songs that we weren't necessarily working on before COVID hit, but now we have the opportunity to get into the lair that we call our practice space and get to work on these songs, so that whenever we're able to play a show again, we can go out and do that. Much to my surprise, there are bars in Windsor booking shows right now. Whether they're following the protocols or not, I have no idea. But we've talked about it as a band, and we aren't necessarily prepared to go out and play a show where, 1, we're behind a plexiglass screen, and 2, nobody can dance or sing. As a cover band, or any band in general, like, if you are into your craft, you want to see the crowd get into it. And to have people basically just sit there, what's the fun in that? Like, what's the enjoyment in that? We've decided that we're going to take the time to learn some new tunes, figure out where we want to go. And it also affords me time to work on, like I say, I've got a little side solo project on the go that I'm trying to write some songs for and record at home. So it gives me extra time to do things like that.
I 100% know what you're talking about, because when I perform stand-up comedy and these interesting times that we're in, there is that plexiglass window in front of you. And what we do as well is, because at open mics, there's one person after another, we have our own mic covers that get handed out to us, and you go up, put your mic cover on, do your spiel, take the mic cover off, throw it out, get your mask back on, walk back to your table. You know, no one was really prepared for this. I was cutting the grass today, and I was just thinking, I never thought I would have to have a dress mask.
Yeah, like that goes with your tuxedo, right?
Exactly. Or if you have like a job interview, it's just like, I'm going to take the good mask instead of your just going out mask. And
it's crazy times. Like,
it
absolutely
totally
is.
I was talking to a really well-known musician in London last week, Anne Moniz, if you've heard of her. I was just saying, like, I hope things open back up and we can start doing the things that we used to do again, going to bars, singing shows.
Oh, yeah.
Sunfest, Home County, Rock the Park, just down the road in St. Thomas, stuff out in Grand Bend. And it's just like this part of Ontario. I mean, Toronto's Toronto. Like, I'm going to just exclude that because it's its own animal.
Yeah, if you can't find a show in Toronto on any given night, you're just not looking hard enough.
Yeah, especially with comedy, because sometimes they'll have like 3 open mics in one night. So you'd literally get off stage, head onto transit, and go to the very next open mic. My point is, this part of Ontario, southwestern Ontario, is really good for supporting music to an extent. But just as far as music festivals and places to check out is awesome. And I just hope that we can get back to that.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Windsor is a little bit weird. Like, we don't have a whole lot of festivals. We have a really huge one that they call Blues Fest, and they expanded it to be over 2 weekends this summer. And of course that didn't go through. And that was one of the disappointments I had. Like, I had tickets to the Saints and Sinners tour, Big Wreck, Moist, the Tea Party, and the Headstone. So, as I'm sure you'll remember, a huge Tea Party fan.
Yes.
So, to see them in their hometown of Windsor is something that is not to be missed. And I've seen them a number of times. I've seen the Headstones. But I was really looking forward to seeing Big Wreck and Moist. I've never seen either of those bands live. COVID hits and it's March, and you're like, oh, maybe it's only going to be a couple months. The show's not till July. We should be okay. May comes around 2 months later. A lot of bands are canceling tours. Like, I live a mile from Detroit. So now you're starting to see all the shows in Detroit get shut down, and you're thinking, holy shit, like, this is serious. And then it gets to the end of June and they cancel the show. It's a shame. And as an artist, like, with you and your comedy and me with the music, like, it's just, you want to be out there doing your thing. And that's probably one of the hardest things, is that you can't right now. And who knows when it's going to get back to normal for us to be able to do our thing. I would play in somebody's garage for free right now if I could find out a way to do it, just to be able to play.
A lot of industry people, the roadies and the people that set up the shows, and August Burns Red and other bands as well, were donating new merch profits to this fund for out-of-work roadies and technical people.
Oh, yeah. Like, there's so many behind-the-scenes people that are out of work right now, but even like that, like small venues where a lot of these bands that we know and love cut their teeth in their local towns. Like in London, think what would happen if Call the Office all of a sudden decided COVID just killed us, we can't open up again. Like, how many local bands would be devastated by that? Like, we've already lost the APK, we lost the Embassy to fire and the Whippet Lounge, and the Wick was torn down. Pretty soon, like, there's not going to be very many places to go if you're in the London area to go catch a show of a band that's any good. Like, there's going to be the Music Hall, Rum Runners, Call the Office, and those are the only 3 I can think of off the top of my head, maybe 765. I did listen to the podcast that you had last week, and I think your guest last week put it perfect. Like, it's one thing to support local musicians and local acts and things like that, but you got to support local venues too. If you got nothing to do on a Saturday night, go check out where somebody's playing and hit up the bar. Number one, you're going to be introduced to a new band that you've never heard of before, and you might just like it. Number two, you're supporting somebody who's doing everything they can to support the local scene. I follow Rise Against fairly well, and they actually just announced they're going to be a part of a 3-day kind of virtual online festival, and all the profits are going to a number of these small venue bars where these bands have cut their teeth. When we get back to some sense of normalcy, we've got to get out more and see these guys and support these bars, because they've been through hell and back with this COVID for sure.
Over the last year or so, I have been battling quite something, quite a situation that I've never experienced before, and just threw a huge spoke into my life, my confidence, my sanity. And along the similar vein, although I know that it's not exactly similar, you have and still do suffer from bipolar.
Yeah. In 2008, I was diagnosed with both bipolar disorder as well as major depressive disorder. And if one's not acting up, usually the other is. It's not something that I am ashamed to talk about now, obviously, but back in the day, it was something that I absolutely hid from everybody that I knew, because at that time, the stigma was so strong, especially if you're a man. And this isn't to take away from women who suffer from mental illness in any way, shape, or form. I just can't relate. I'm not a woman, but I can speak to the male condition of it. And in 2008, when I was diagnosed, if not for the love of God, I wouldn't be here. It was something I kind of sensed in myself years and years before. And I had a diagnosis back in 2004 or 5, I want to say, and I was on some medication, and medication's weird because you feel better when you take your meds. Back when I was first diagnosed, I made the foolish mistake of stopping my meds. And the reason for that is pretty simple when you're a guy. Even when you have the flu, you do the same thing. I feel better. I don't need the meds anymore.
Right.
It took a year or two for the meds to kind of get me to what I thought was an even keel, and then stopped taking them, and then relapsed in 2008. And that's when, like I said, if not for the grace of God, I wouldn't be here. I had a suicidal episode, didn't make an attempt on my life, but came very, very close to it. It was difficult to talk to anybody about it, because as a man you're taught to be strong, and you're taught not to show any weakness, and you're taught to pull up your bootstraps and get to work and provide for your family and do this and do that. To do that when you have a mental illness of any kind is very, very difficult. But
Yes.
To do that with a mental illness and not have an outlet to talk about it to anyone makes it doubly difficult. The biggest piece of advice I've been giving to people ever since I've been so open about my illness and my diagnoses is that, if nothing else, find at least one person that you trust implicitly with your life and tell them everything. Don't hold back. Don't feel like you're burdening them. You know, if somebody ever considered me to be that one person, that'd be great, because I'd rather listen to them for 3 hours go on about the hardships in their life than to sit through a 15-minute eulogy.
Exactly. And to comment on what you were just saying about the stigma, especially around males, is exactly right. We are raised to not have any emotion, or to be seen as quote unquote weak. And another thing too about the stigma is, and I'm just guessing, but I would imagine that you went through this too, is it's not bad enough that you have a mental illness, but having the mental illness causes you to get worse. You're embarrassed of it, or you are worried about how people are going to perceive you, or you're worried about how it's going to affect your life or your future or your ability to do the important things of life.
Yeah, for sure. And that goes right back to that whole stigma piece that we've been talking about, right? That's all part of that. It's, how can I put this? Mental illness is a bitch to deal with in the best of times, but a lot of people who suffer in silence put so much undue pressure on themselves because of that stigma. There's 100 different ways to treat 100 different illnesses, right? But mental illness is weird in that there's no blood test for it. Like, you can't run on a treadmill and have a stress test and say, yeah, nope, there it is, kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. Like you say, like, you get the diagnosis and your first reaction is almost always, oh shit, what am I going to do now? Right? Because at least for me, when I was diagnosed, bipolar disorder and depressive disorder have been around forever, but they didn't have the attention that they have today. So to me, the treatment options were really limited to pharmaceutical, and that was about it. When I had my suicidal episode, I went to the hospital and they not turned me away, but determined that I wasn't, for lack of a better term, suicidal enough to warrant being brought in. And they gave me a referral to an outpatient doctor the next day. That appointment threw me completely off, and I felt, in my mind, I wasn't taken seriously enough. Mm-hmm. Like, if no one was going to advocate for me, then I had to advocate for me and make sure that people were listening. Even if I had to stomp my feet and dig my heels in and yell and scream to be heard, then that's what needed to be done.
Through this whole experience of mine, I learned a lot about mental health and people that go through it, and going through programs and groups and different therapies. I learned a great deal of information. Like, part of the reason why I think maybe those doctors turned you away, not suicidal enough, is everybody multiple times throughout their life have something called suicidal ideations, where they just think about death. There's a condition that goes a little bit further called parasuicidal, where you're not just thinking about suicide or your mortality, but you fantasize about it, but don't do anything about it. And then there's people like me who unfortunately got so screwed up in such a short amount of time that did try an attempt and it failed. And it's kind of like I woke up in a whole new world, or as a new person, basically starting at less than zero, trying to dig my way out of it. What the stigma part is, what you had said about you stopped taking your medication, I think a lot of people do treat it like that, as something that you can get better from. A lot of people kind of see mental illness as something that needs to be taken care of so that it doesn't inconvenience everybody else. And I know that sounds harsh, because there are people, the majority of people, who genuinely do care about their family member, their friend, their spouse, children, but they just don't know how to respond, because they can be as supportive as they can be, but they don't know what you think about in your head. They can't see the picture that you're painting in your head. So it kind of seems like there's a small fraction of the population that just still sees it as something that can be fixed. For example, I had the conversation with my doctor the other day about weaning off of my medication, and she was like, oh, no, you're probably going to be on this for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that too. And it took me the longest time to accept the fact that I'll be on some sort of cocktail of antidepressants and medication to keep my bipolar disorder in check for the rest of my life. If I even so much as miss a couple days of doses, my wife will tell me that she'll know just in my mannerisms or in my mood or my behavior that, did you take your pills this morning or did you miss a couple days or whatever? And yeah. And she's like, yeah, you need to get back on that. And that's the thing. Like, people need to realize, well, let me backtrack. As I've kind of learned through my travels, there's two different sets of mental illness. There's episodic, where something will trigger a mental episode, whether it's a depressive bout or whatever. Like, it could be a death in the family, it could be the loss of a job, it could be the loss of a child, it could be something like that. And they'll say that typically 1 in 5 Canadians will experience something like that. And that's something that you can bounce back from, that you might need something to kind of get you over the hump with time and therapy and prescription to kind of help you get over that hurdle. You're going to go back to about the way you were. And then there's the people like me, and I'm not going to presume to put you in one bucket or the other. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm not going to get into that, but I can speak to my experience. And my experience is one where it's a chronic condition. If I don't take my medication, then my mood swings go from being what a typical normal person would be, where you have some good days, you have some bad days, you have the slight ups and downs, to having the mountain peaks and the Marianas Trench depth of valleys kind of thing. And there's no real in between. And if you're manic for days. Like, I can remember a manic episode once lasting me about a week and a half, and I may have slept 5 hours that week total. When you add depression onto a bipolar disorder, my experience is that the mania isn't quite as manic, but those lows will almost always you'll wish for death at some point, because you just don't feel like you're ever going to crawl back out of it. So when I started my medication, what they don't tell you is that you're going to be 6 weeks to 2 months before you even begin to start to feel better, because it's a slow burn-in process to change the chemicals in your brain. Because really, that's what mental illness is. Your mood is in disorder. So to fix that, you need to fix the chemistry in your brain. That's not something that's going to happen overnight, right? That burn-in process does take a little bit. In my case, the burn-in process from the first set of medication I did was almost worse than the disease. It works great for some people. For me, I was in the fetal position on my couch, gritting my teeth for hours at a time, just trying to get through the day. Like, it just, for whatever reason, that one didn't work. So my doctor went, okay, we're going to wean you off that one. We're going to start the next one. And I'm on, I take right now, 11 pills a day.
Like 11 different meds, or just double doses of meds?
I'm on, let me count them out, 1, 2, 3, 4 different meds.
Yeah, me too.
And I've become completely comfortable with the fact that I'll be on medication for the rest of my life. And if that's what keeps me relatively even-keeled, then so be it. Because the alternative, as I have discovered through my own experience of this, is eventually I just won't want to be here. And one of these times it's going to get to the point where I am going to be suicidal and I am going to be successful. And the medicated Noel knows that I have a lot to live for, and that's not a place where I want to go.
I take like 4 meds, and I also take a 5th one that's sort of as needed, because with me, not only do I have major depressive disorder, but I have super high anxiety.
Okay.
Which is kind of dark humor-wise hilarious, because I get anxious about the fact that I have depression and what it might do to my life. What am I going to be able to do? What am I not going to be able to do? Am I going to be able to be a functional, present, and good father to my 2 children? And it's like, people might not realize you're working twice as hard to get like 4 times less the result.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I was absolutely there in my journey, right? Like, I've got my 3 boys and I adore them to death. And I've been married now for 5 years with my wife for a total of 12. So she has seen me at my absolute highest and my absolute lowest. And like, God bless her, she saved my life. Like, there's not a doubt in my mind. To your point, the thing with mental illness is, you're exactly right. Like, it takes double the effort, right? The whole point of it is that eventually it gets better, right? Like, for me, I'm 12, 15 years into my journey, and it's taken me that long to realize that. And I like to think that I'm reasonably successful. I have a job, I have a roof over my head, I've never gone hungry in a day. My wife is great. I have a hobby that I can go out and enjoy. I'm in a much better place now than I was 12 years ago. And the fact that I can look back on myself and see that lets me know that I'm not going to let my diagnosis be my definition. It's a part of me, absolutely, 100%, but it's not going to rule my life. If that means things like prescriptions for the rest of my life, so be it. If it means things like group therapy or one-on-one therapy to make sure that my head's on straight, so be it. It's got to be better than the alternative, 100%.
And the thing is, nobody ever asks for this. Like, who would, right? Like,
it's a brutal thing, but it's manageable. And it took me a long time, longer than a year or 2. Like, it took me 5 or 6 or 7 years and a couple of leaves from work to finally get to the point where I feel it's managed. Having that feeling now, like, I can look back on my experiences that I had and will go like, holy shit, like, that was really close to being something really bad.
When you do cross that threshold and come back, rightly so, you're looked at in a different way. A lot of the times it might be coming from a place of caring about you and love, but it can also be very patronizing. Like, you are born again. You're an infant that needs to be taken really good care of so you don't harm yourself. And with the medication, I just thought I was in a very fortunate place to have some sort of benefits to pay for medication or help pay for medication. And I completely understand now people who are on the street because they don't have resources to get medication.
Yeah.
There is ODSP. That's mainly used more for elderly people. If you're under 25, you get free meds. But everybody in between, if you don't have a job, if you're not fortunate enough to have employer-provided health benefits, you're fucked. I completely see why when you walk down the street downtown traditionally and see a homeless person, it's like, oh, well, how they end up like that? It's just like their life has gone down a downward spiral, and that can trigger mental illness. And if you don't have access to medication and therapy treatments, you just keep going down that spiral.
Yeah, this is where I get up on my soapbox and get a little political, because this has always been a sore spot to me, and you just happen to scratch that nerve, so I'm going to jump on my soapbox for a minute. So one of my big stances has always been universal pharmacare for every Canadian, regardless of age or means, and that's the exact reason why. Like, no one chooses to be homeless. No one chooses to live on the streets or have to live in a shelter or have to deal with a Canadian winter in the middle of Victoria Park. Like, that's just not the way it works. And like you mentioned, a lot of the homeless population have mental illness. And it's untreated mental illness. And mental illness, if you don't treat it, gets worse. It's like any other disease. It 100% doesn't just stop at one certain point and goes no further. Like you mentioned, it will spiral, and it will continue to drag you down and drag you down and drag you down. You're at a point of no return. And if we could, like, I'm not necessarily advocating for the end of homelessness here. Like, that's absolutely something that we should do too. But my soapbox rant for this particular topic is the universal pharmacare for everybody. Make drugs available for everybody. We already have the healthcare, right? There's already a number of clinics that anybody who's homeless has an opportunity to go to. But what good is going to a doctor if you have to pay $200 to get a month's worth of Seroquel? Like, it's an unrealistic expectation. So great, you give them that, but then where do they go from there? And I know that there are government benefits that can help, and if they happen to be disabled in some other way, there's a disability tax credit, or there's the Ontario Disability Support Plan, or things like that. But like you mentioned, either the Ontario drug plan is when you hit 65, or if you're 25, a certain number of prescriptions in Ontario are provided free of charge or at limited cost to the person under 25. But what happens for the 40 years in between? There's nothing there yet to be able to aid those people who are most in need of it. And had I won the election that I ran in 2008, I would absolutely have advocated it for it then, and I still advocate for it today. We absolutely need to do more to protect those who are most vulnerable. To me, there's nothing more Canadian than doing that, but we're missing a very important piece.
Even more so with the things that have been going on with COVID, I would imagine it has triggered a lot of mental illness in a lot more people.
Absolutely. I couldn't imagine the stress. Like, I'm lucky enough that I work in an industry that I'm able to work from home. So in that regard, touch wood, I haven't been affected, but my kids have. My oldest son works at a restaurant that closed down. He had just moved in with his girlfriend. Having to try and figure out how I'm going to pay rent next month. Like, how do you do that kind of thing, right? My youngest is getting ready to go off to university. He needed a summer job this year that he couldn't get because of COVID. My middle guy lost his job at the call center he was working at. You know, first it gets shut down because it's a huge place to have a bunch of people standing around, and then the company that ran the call center decided to shut it down. Like, those stressors are huge things to deal with. I can't imagine what it would feel like not knowing how I'm going to get my next meal or how I'm going to pay my rent this month so that I can keep my roof over my head. You know, God forbid, like, something should happen to my wife. Like, what? Like, that stressor, like, when I talk about the episodic type mental illness, I would love to see a study done from March till whenever we get back to whatever normal is going to look like. How many people had mental health type episodes due to stress? Like, that number is going to be absolutely through the roof, I think.
I would imagine so too. For me, even before COVID, it was exactly what you were just talking about. It was a bunch of difficult stressors that unfortunately happened at the same time as each other, one on top of the other, that I wasn't dealing with emotionally or mentally. I was really busy, so I didn't really have time to think about what was going on in my life. And then malnutrition, because I'm the kind of person that may be to my detriment if need to save money or make sure that ends meet. I'll cut stuff out.
Yeah.
I'm sort of practical in that way, but it's like too practical because it leads to malnutrition, and also the stressors and the chemicals that are racing through your body, like cortisol and others, can cause sleep problems. And if you're not sleeping, that just compounds it and makes it worse. And people snap, completely snap.
Yeah. And it's very easy to see how that can happen, right? The biggest piece of advice that I can give, like I said, is find somebody, even if it's just one person, that you implicitly trust with your life. I've always said to anyone who knows me, like I spent years and years and years hiding my diagnosis and running away from it and not acknowledging it. And now I'm very open about it. I will speak to anyone at any point and any time. I will give my phone number to anyone, literally anyone who needs that support. And if my phone rings middle of the night, I will groggily answer it and talk somebody through it, because I'd rather hear them, like I said, go through their problems than to sit through their funeral. Everybody needs that person, but more so if you have a mental illness, because it's very easy in the mind of somebody who suffers from depression or bipolar disorder to feel all alone. And that's the biggest message that we have to get out to everybody, is that you're never alone.
I want to once again thank Noel Burgon for joining me on this episode of the Scott Loves Puns podcast. You can check out more about the band Out of Time at outoftimeband.ca. You can check me out on Instagram and TikTok at Scott_loves_puns. Puns is with a Z. You can find me on YouTube by searching Scott Loves Puns _ASMR. You can check out my audiobook and my new comedy EP, Okayest Hits, which both are on sale for only $2 and $1 at swoaudio.bandcamp.com. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good night.